I want to talk about Wang Mang today because that dude is a contender for being the absolute goat of terrible economic policy. If you haven't heard about him, you're in for a treat, because he might just have the worst track record in all of history when it comes to economic competence. So he was born in 45 BC as a son of Wang Mang, who probably went his entire life without knowing how funny his name was, and they were part of like a secondary branch of the Chinese royal family. I think he was the cousin of the emperor or something, but the important thing is just that he wasn't in the line of succession. So growing up, Mang was slowly making a name for himself, becoming known for being competent and scholarly and just an all-around good dude. Like, he was caring for his extended family when they were sick, reading Confucius, and just generally doing all the things that were expected of a promising young Chinese noble. But I suspect it might have been a facade, because eventually he ended up poisoning the reigning emperor and usurping his throne to start his own Xin dynasty. Although personally, I think it's a bit of a stretch calling it that, because he was the only emperor of said dynasty. Anyway, the whole murder and usurpation thing wasn't actually the problematic part. The real problem started when it became time for Wang Mang to actually rule. You see, Mang wasn't just reading Confucius, more like he was absolutely obsessed with his writings. He became convinced that to usher in another golden age, he'd have to restore the empire to how it was under the Zhao dynasty, which was when Confucius was writing, which at that point was something like 500 years back. And so in his mission to Confucify everything, Wang got up to some extremely wacky antics. For example, he believed in his own version of what's called the rectification of names, which is a Confucian doctrine that states that things should be named in accordance with reality and it's supposed to aid societal harmony. Well, Wang Mang took it a step further because he seemed to think that not only should things be named in accordance with reality, but also the other way around, in the sense that things would start acting in accordance to their name. So essentially, Wang Mang seemed to think that he could change the nature of things simply by changing their names, and naturally he got completely obsessed with just renaming everything in his empire, like cities and landmarks. But he didn't stop at material things, no. At one point, he even outlawed giving your children names that are more than one Chinese character long. What could possibly be the logic behind such a law, you may ask? Well, it turns out in Confucius' writings, most of the characters just have one character names, so obviously that must be the correct way to name people. Apparently, this is also the reason why everyone in the Three Kingdoms novel, for example, only has one character names, because it took a couple hundred years for that trend to die down again. But probably the most absurd of all his renaming shenanigans was when he attempted to unilaterally rename a very powerful nomadic confederation from Zhongnu, which meant ferocious slaves, to Gongnu, which meant respectful slaves, because he believed it would actually make them less ferocious and thus easier to deal with. He also apparently couldn't stop himself from changing the official title of the leader of said confederation to a pun. In fact, he actually did it twice. Anyway, this kicked off a pretty big conflict that lasted longer than his dynasty, and it wasn't even the only war that he started like that. But I don't want to spend too much time on his diplomacy or his foreign policy, because this video is about his economic policy, and he had strong opinions in that area as well. So at this point, I should reiterate that the time of the Zhao dynasty, which they were trying to mimic, was about 500 years back. And seeing as this was around the year 0, historic records weren't exactly perfect. So Mang Wang and his court spent a lot of their time just reading Confucian classics or legends of the time in order to figure out how exactly things were run back then. In fact, this took up so much time that they kind of neglected governing the empire that they were currently running. So an example of this is that at some point Wang Mang decided that the pay scale that the preceding Han dynasty used for the empire's bureaucrats and administrators was unacceptable, and obviously it had to be replaced with the pay scale that the Zhao dynasty used. The only problem with that was that at the time they had no idea what that pay scale actually was, so he just stopped paying their wages for years. The funny thing is, when he finally figured out how they were paid in the Zhao dynasty, it turned out that it was based on how prosperous the empire was at that time. And since that is a really subjective metric, he just decided to continue not paying them, so bureaucrats and administrators just got no wages until the end of his dynasty. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in one of the most corrupt administrations in all of history, as the civil servants literally had to rely on bribes to put food on their tables. I wanted to mention this because the absolutely insane levels of corruption corruption will actually explain why some of his later policies fail as disastrously as they do. Apart from not paying his employees, Wang Mang also had other interesting policy ideas. At one point, he decided to nationalize all the land in the empire for the purpose of redistribution. He called it Wang Tian, which basically means Wang's fields because he was humble like that. This was, like most of the things he did, also copied from the Zhou dynasty, where they called it the well-field system. Unlike them though, Wang Mang didn't have a functioning administration as he didn't pay them. And also unlike them, Wang Mang was just not particularly interested in making sure things ran smoothly at all. So the officials who administered the whole thing essentially just started handing out the land to their clan members and whoever would bribe them, and it ended up working out so terribly that even the farmers who were supposed to be the main beneficiaries of this whole exercise ended up hating it. It was such a colossal failure that even though just criticizing the system was punished by exile, it ended up being so massively unpopular that Wang was forced to abolish it after just 3 years. As you can imagine, this didn't translate into great fiscal results, so in an attempt to fill the empire's dwindling coffers, Mang instituted a bunch of other policies. One of his smarter moves was setting up a 10% income tax for a bunch of sectors, which, fun fact, is often cited as the first example of an income tax in all of history. This ended up being massively unpopular, of course, but it did end up lasting 12 whole years, which makes it one of Mang's more successful policies. He also tried setting up government monopolies on various industries. However, as he still wasn't paying any of his administrators, they ended up pocketing most of the proceeds, and so almost nothing ever reached the imperial treasury. Another attempt at raising revenue was the so-called sloth tax, which was essentially a tax on having uncultivated land or not working if you're a citizen. In classic Mang fashion, he did not think this through all the way because the whole tax applied without any exceptions. This caused a whole bunch of people who couldn't work or who had properties that were just not suitable for cultivation to either abandon their property or just sell themselves into slavery to help their family pay the tax. The whole selling yourself into slavery part is actually particularly ironic because Mang outlawed the slave trade a while earlier. Mind you, he did not have a problem with slavery itself, no, he just thought you shouldn't be able to trade them. Apparently that's what Confucius would have wanted. But arguably the funniest thing is that through all of this, Wang Mang just could not stop himself from introducing more and more coins. Well, technically not just coins, but we will get to that. So before Wang Mang took charge, the empire had one coin, keeping it simple. But obviously this wasn't Confucian enough for our boy. No, he wanted 28 different kinds of coins. And you would think that would be enough, but no. When I was researching this, I kept getting confused because I kept reading different numbers for how many denominations he ultimately introduced. And that's because he apparently didn't just stick to using coins as money, but he also made currency from tortoise shells and cowrie shells, which apparently are not coins. And that says something because Wang Mang had a very broad definition of what constitutes a coin, like this abomination. This is called a knife coin because, well, there is a knife attached to the coin. In the end, there were like 37 different kind of coin denominations that were used in the Xin dynasty, but I don't even think that properly conveys how stupid the whole system was, because they didn't come in useful intervals like today's denominations come, like 1, 2, 5, 10 cent and so on. They did have some useful intervals. It would be hard to avoid that entirely with 37 different types of coins, but they also had a bunch of really strange ones and also duplicate coins. So for example, there was a $3 seashell, which was unique, so it had a purpose, but there was also a 10, a 30 and a $50 seashell, which there were also copper coins for these values. And the intervals weren't also always super logical. Like the next biggest seashell after the $50 seashell was a $216 seashell. Why $216? I have no idea, but I would be willing to bet money on the fact that it somehow goes back to Confucius again. There was, of course, also a $2,160 tortoise shell coin, as well as a $1,580 silver coin. So this whole hodgepodge of denominations made giving out change a massive headache. There's a great stand-up maths video about exactly this topic, go watch it if you're interested. There's also another problem, and that is called Gresham's law. Gresham's law is a monetary principle that states that bad money drives out good money. What this means, if you have two different coins with the same nominal value, so let's say they're both worth $1, but different intrinsic values, for example, if one of them was made out of gold and the other one was a freaking seashell, you would probably like to hold on to the gold coin and go spend the seashell coin. You know, just in case this whole seashell thing doesn't catch on. The problem then becomes that since everybody would like to hold on to their gold and spend the currency that's intrinsically less valuable because you can collect it on the beach, the gold eventually stops circulating in the economy because nobody is using it for any trades anymore. And that's what we mean with bad money driving out the good money, so the gold in this case. Initially, when I researched this whole coin thing, I thought, man, this must be the best example in all of history of bad money driving out good money. But it turns out the whole system was so stupid that it didn't even come to that. So the currency was really susceptible to counterfeit, for which the punishment, funnily enough, was slavery. In fact, Wang Mang really seemed to like sending all the people who broke his laws into slavery, but that's another issue altogether. Because of the issues with the counterfeit currency and also just the general unwieldiness of the entire system, people just kinda stopped using money altogether. Like the entire monetary economy just ground to a screeching halt. Eventually, people adapted by just starting to use the old Han Dynasty coins again, which funnily enough was also illegal, but the whole thing was such a disaster that Mang was eventually forced to abolish 35 out of his 37 coins again anyway. At that point, the damage had been done though, and people just lost so much trust in the system that they just continued using the old Han Dynasty coins anyway. So those were kind of the highlights of Mang Wang's career. Eventually he ended up being killed in a massive peasant rebellion, which surprisingly enough wasn't caused by his policies. Instead, a couple years into his reign, there was a catastrophic shift of the Yellow River, which led to a big famine and a massive displacement of peasants, which eventually triggered the peasant rebellions that would be his demise. But in classic Wang Mang fashion, he didn't just die a normal, boring death, because when he was killed, people started arguing about who would get the credit for having killed him, and this eventually led to a fight which resulted in dozens of dead soldiers. His head was then cut off and delivered to the provisional capital of the new emperor, who then impaled it on a spike and put it on the wall, but the people were so angry that they took it off the wall and started kicking it around, and then also apparently one person ate his tongue. I don't know if back then that was considered an appropriate reaction, but personally it just seems a bit unnecessary. Apparently the head was eventually preserved and kept in a court vault until it was destroyed in a fire a couple hundred years later. Anyway, this seems like a fitting end for this iconic man, and if you ever feel like your government is not doing a very good job governing, remember that it could be worse. Probably. That's the end for this video. You can go watch the stand-up maths video now.